Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning into Health Podcast Show, the place to be to get the insights of leaders working at the intersection of health, science, and media. I'm your host, Dan Kendall, and this episode features a recording from the 2025 Health Podcast Summit, which was held on October 1st and 2nd. In total, we interviewed 42 speakers in 37 sessions that span topics across health, science, policy, and podcasting. You can wait to get access to all the sessions as we publish them here on your favorite platform, or you can get access to all the recordings, links, and resources by visiting our website at healthpodcast.org. Again, that's healthpodcast.org. Enjoy the show. Welcome to this session of Health Podcast Summit 2025. I'm your host, Dan Kendall, and our next guest is James Cridland. James is the editor of Pod News and a veteran BBC radio journalist who's been tracking the podcast industry and in many ways leading it since it began over 20 years ago. His philosophy is that podcasts are, quote, something for your ears when your eyes are busy, unquote, which is a perfect illustration of why podcasts are a great way for healthcare professionals and patients to access information about health and care. In this session, James reveals that Americans now consume 773 million hours of podcasts per week, a threefold increase in 10 years. He shares why super serving a specific population beats chasing mass audiences with generic wellness content. And he explains why his own podcast, the Pod News Weekly Review, proves that reaching the right audience of 200 people matters more than reaching random thousands. I'd like to take a moment to thank all our sponsors and partners who make Health Podcast Summit 2025 possible. A special thanks to our gold sponsor, BetterHelp, and to our silver sponsor, ZS. Please visit healthpodcastsummit.com for links to all these organizations and special offers. Now let's turn to my conversation with James Cridland. James Cridland, thank you so much for joining me here at Health Podcast Summit.
It's really good to be here. Thank you for asking.
James, I've seen you at a lot of events over the years. I've observed you from afar before we became a member of your Pod News community. And when preparing for this interview, I did a deep dive. I went back and watched a lot of your videos. You've been talking about this for a long time. You've been really a cornerstone of the podcast industry. And I was really struggling with what to ask you about because it's sort of like interviewing the Wikipedia of podcasts. You seem to know everything about everything. So
citation needed.
So we're going to have another session where we have Gabriel Soto from Edison Research share some of the information from their perspective. But a lot of the sessions that I've seen you do over the years and that are online talk a lot about data. And so in addition to the information that Edison Research publishes and that you've been a part of in launching that each year, what are some of the other things that listeners and the audience of this event should be looking at in terms of understanding what's happening in the podcast ecosystem?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some really useful data which is out there. Edison Research do a fantastic job of pulling together a lot of really interesting data, but there's lots of other things out there. And I think if you're a creator who is already making a podcast, then the number one place for you to go, apart from your own podcast host, which of course has all of your numbers, is to go into Apple Podcast Connect and to go into Spotify for Creators and YouTube Studio and look at all of the data which is available in there, because there is a ton of data which really helps you understand what your podcast listeners are consuming. When they stop listening, there may be a feature that you do in your podcast which people really hate and they skip past, and you can absolutely see that in some of this additional information. So using those tools are really useful. There are also obviously rankers, across the world as well. And the only caution that I would give you in terms of looking at charts and rankers is that they don't necessarily measure the things that you think that they measure. So particularly Apple Podcasts. Apple Podcasts has lots of charts. That doesn't actually measure the most popular shows at all. In fact, it's measuring the most popular shows that people have hit the follow button to over the last couple of days. And it's got a complicated weighting thing and everything else. So just be aware of how these charts are worked out. There's obviously plenty of articles on the Pod News newsletter there as well. The other one that I would probably point people to is OP3, which is an open data analytics tool for podcasts. Now, you can actually pull all of the open data for other shows that might happen to be in the same genre as you. And that's a really useful thing to be able to take a peek at. I've managed to pull some data out of OP3 and keep it updated at a website which is called podcastbusinessjournal.com/data. And you can go in and find out how other people in the same genre as you are doing, where they're getting the traffic from, whether people are using Apple or Spotify or other platforms. So all of that data is also available in there. So there's lots and lots of information out there. So great that you've got Gabriel on. He's a really bright guy looking at the proper research that is out there. But the raw numbers, there's all kinds of numbers and all kinds of information there too.
So what are some of the general trends that you might want to point out, in addition to what Edison is reporting in their March report each year in the Edison Research Insights? What are some of the other things that you're seeing in terms of time spent listening? Because I know when we look at this data, we tend to gravitate towards downloads. But I know I've heard you talk a lot about we need a different metric, particularly with your radio experience. You've talked about having a different metric about how we evaluate the success of the content we're creating.
I mean, obviously, downloads is one thing. Downloads isn't a fantastic number, to be honest. It's a number which can be confused by a lot of different things. I am much more interested in how much consumption of podcasts there is to be able to show how the industry is growing. Then looking at total downloads is one thing. Looking at the reach of the of available audience that podcasting is reaching, that's another number that we end up seeing. But the number for me, the number that really tells the story of how podcasting is growing is just the raw numbers. How many hours per week are consumed in terms of listening to podcasts. So right now we're looking at a number of 773 million hours a week are spent consuming podcasts just in the US. 773 million hours is a tremendous number. And I think what we'll see is that number continues to go up. It's gone up more than 3 times in the last 10 years. And my suspicion is that will continue to go up. And it really shows the benefit and the power that podcasting has is the amount of time that people are actually spending with it. So that's the number that I'm always particularly keen at taking a look at.
That's a great point. And we will have citations and this information in this session description. So I know you've mentioned a few different resources already. So just make sure the audience knows that they can go to the description of this session and find links to all of this. And I also want to encourage everyone to sign up for your Pod News newsletter and your podcast. Like the newsletter and podcast come out on a daily, Monday to Friday.
Yes.
You've got your Podcast Business Journal you mentioned as well, which you acquired a couple of years ago, I believe. And then you also have the weekly the podcast news review that you do, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. You described and you were giving out in Texas these stickers that say something for your ears when your eyes are busy. So before we get into sort of the role of video in podcasting, can we just talk about that? You mentioned the 773 million hours. How does the audio environment, having come from radio and moving into podcasts, how do you value and evaluate the value of what you're doing there when you're creating this audio content for people? Why is this such an important component of ways to reach audiences?
I think that's the big benefit of podcasts over any other medium is that, audio is a multitasking medium. And so that whole thing of something for your ears when your eyes are busy is really my definition of what a podcast is. It has to work. If you close your eyes, or if your eyes are busy focused on, driving down the highway, or doing the washing up, or whatever it is that you're doing, a podcast still has to work in terms of audio. That's what makes a podcast in my mind. So I think that that's certainly worthwhile bearing in mind. The number two activity most of the time when people are listening to a podcast is driving. It's in the car. That's a big activity. Number one is actually being at home. And interestingly, quite a lot of people answer those sorts of surveys by saying, I'm doing nothing when I'm listening to podcasts. Normally that means that they're falling asleep, or or they're just lying down on their sofa having listened to their favorite show. But I think, the other sort of side of podcasting is that, and the thing that really works is it's habitual. We tend to listen to the same thing at the same time every week, or we tend to listen to the same thing when we're doing the same job, when we're driving, when we're out doing the supermarket run, when we're doing, all of those sorts of things. So I think from that point of view, it makes a ton of sense to think of podcasting as being a very habitual thing, which means, of course, that if you're making a podcast, it means coming out at the same time every week, or whenever your audience is expecting you. It means being there in a consistent way, because great audio works when it's habitual. And the only way of really growing a habit is that you are there when the audience is expecting you. So I think that there's certainly something to be said for that habitual nature of podcasting, as well as the fact that it's the only real medium that you can enjoy while you're busy doing something else. Something for your ears when your eyes are busy is a superpower, and we should be super excited that podcasting has that virtually nothing else does.
It strikes me that in podcasting, we do have a lot of different opinions about what that is. And at the root, where it started was in terms of an open RSS, the ability to publish your own content, make it available publicly for distribution, and it was audio only. Now, if you talk to people like Brian Barletta from Sounds Profitable and other people, we talk about audio forward. And something I've been saying for years is that podcasts aren't audio only. They're audio first. We think about that audio first experience. If you can drive and listen to a football game or listen to a baseball game, then why can't you do that with other sorts of content, particularly as we're focused on here in healthcare? But it seems like more and more as I speak to people in the health industry about the use of podcasts, their question is around video. When shouldn't I be really focused about my YouTube strategy, my video strategy? So you just came away from this meeting in Dallas, Texas. I'm sure that video was a big discussion there. You talk about it almost every week in your weekly recap with Sam Sethi. So can you sort of give us in the healthcare space a little bit of an understanding from someone who is so embedded in the industry and understands so many aspects of it? How should we be thinking about the use of audio and video in connecting with our audiences?
I think that the number one thing is to make sure that the audio that you are producing is great. The audio that you are doing makes the most amount of sense, because it's the audio that makes for a great show. Now, what I'm not saying is don't worry about video. I think if you can, of course, then produce video as well. My own experiences are that it doesn't really change the amount of listeners that you have on the audio platforms, and it doesn't seem to have much of an effect, to be honest, on those. But of course, getting the most out of your content is the important thing. And if you happen to have a nice video set up, and you can deal with the large amount of additional work that you have to do in order to produce video, if you can do that, then great, because that reaches a wider audience. Of course, YouTube will be delighted to see your content if it includes video as well, because guess what? They can sell advertising around it. So of course they're going to be happy about that. I was interested, Dan. I was, as you say, at Podcast Movement in Dallas, and I was expecting a lot of talk about video. And yes, there were some people in the expo hall who were promoting their fancy lights and their nice cameras and all of that kind of thing. But there weren't very many, and there wasn't as much talk about video this year as there was last year. So I almost wonder whether or not, you mentioned, is audio-only podcasts a fad, and is it going away and we should focus on video? I'm almost wondering whether actually people are thinking that video might be the bit that is the fad, and that we should be just remembering that the real numbers come from audio. Adam Curry was there, who was the co-founder of the co-inventor of podcasting, and he said a really interesting thing. He said, if video is number one, then MTV would still be around as a music television station. And it's not. There's still a channel called MTV, but it's full of real documentaries and that sort of thing. And I think that that's a really interesting point, that actually, once you have a look at all of this, you can point to video being a nice to have, but it's the audio that really makes that difference.
Yeah, I use actually a music analogy when I discuss it with people. It's like having a band and saying the only way you can connect with your audience is a live performance or a video. Well, there's a lot of bands that would never have made it if the only way they could reach and find their audience is if they had to do something visual or in person. Yeah. So they need to focus on that audio experience. Why? Because that's where the audience is. So you need to think about how you serve your audience. And for us in healthcare, our healthcare audience is either, if it's the general public or a specific patient population, they're probably very time poor. They're probably searching for information. They probably don't want to have to look at an 8-minute or 12-minute or 20-minute videos in order to get the information. And certainly from a health professional point of view, these folks are extremely busy. So being able to slot into their lives on their drive home or when they're cooking or when they're in the gym is a really important value of being able to serve them in that way.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I think, focusing on producing great content that works as audio is the number one thing. If it happens to have video and you can deal with all of that additional hassle, then absolutely do that. But the video is not the thing that you have to have. The great audio and the great content is the thing that you have to have.
So we've mentioned it a few times, the podcast movement. It's going to be held in New York in September of 2026. So I really want to encourage people to put that on their calendars. I don't have the dates to hand, but we'll make sure we link to where you can get your registration. Do you happen to know them, James?
I'm not sure that there are dates actually written down yet. So yes, it's all new for all of us. But yeah, and I'm looking forward to New York because actually, it's a very different location, but it does mean that it's more accessible to more people, given that there are very expensive hotels in New York, but there are also very cheap ones, I happen to know. And similarly, it can be very cheap to get there as well. So I'm looking forward to the opportunities that gives us.
At that event in Dallas, you were on a panel, and the panel was around the content niche paradox. And I know I speak to a lot of people and they say, well, I want to reach everyone with this, or I need big numbers, or, why does that show only have 200 downloads per episode? And they think they need to have a big audience in order to be successful. And we know, you and I'm sure we know a lot of people who are being very successful, running their businesses or having an impact with very small audiences. And sometimes when you create things for everyone, it kind of tastes like it's made for no one. So can you share some of the things that were discussed on that panel and sort of your take as you've seen a lot of podcasts develop over the years?
Yeah, it was a really good panel, actually. Firstly, I learned how to pronounce niche. I was there thinking that Americans called it niche, but all of the Americans on the panel called it niche. So I was much happier. So that was a good start. One of the panelists, for example, was from a broadcaster. Now he was from a podcast network run by a broadcaster. And the difference there is that if you're a broadcaster, you have an FM signal, you want as many people as possible to be listening to that FM signal, because that's how you get the best value out of that. And so you make your programming as broad as you possibly can so that it attracts as many people as you possibly can. And that's fine if you're running an FM radio station. If you're running something which is there to serve a particular audience, then going almost as niche as you can to really focus on that particular audience is really important. So, if you're doing a specific podcast about something, don't be afraid to be too focused. Don't be afraid to, if you know who your audience is, then actually super serving that audience is the right plan. And pretty well everybody on the panel basically said that bigger isn't always better in terms of podcasting, and that actually, if you're reaching the right people and a high percentage of the right people, then that's the most important thing in comparison to just reaching lots of folks. So, the Pod News Weekly Review, which is the long form podcast that I do every week with Sam Sethi, that podcast doesn't actually get an awful lot of downloads. You can see how many downloads it gets, but it doesn't get an awful lot of downloads. What it does do, though, is it reaches exactly the right people, the types of people that are really interested in that particular topic, the types of people that are very senior in terms of podcasting, in my particular case. That's exactly who it reaches. It doesn't need to reach Joe Rogan numbers or Call Her Daddy numbers. All it needs to reach is the right people. So looking at who you're targeting and making sure that you are targeting those people correctly is a much better plan than trying to reach everybody, because everybody, I'm afraid, isn't going to be interested in some of the things that you talk about in your show. That's how these things work.
Going back again to your radio days, I spent a lot of time listening to radio. I was a sales rep, so I spent a lot of time driving around. And really, you were trying to optimize for that audience of 5 to 7 p.m., the drive time audience, Monday to Friday. That was really where the big value was, or in the morning. And really with podcasts, since they are so mobile, when you do find that audience, it's very easy for them to post about it, for them to send it as a text message link to their parent or their friend to say, I saw this or heard this and I thought you might be interested in it. And honestly, a lot of the ways that we're still discovering podcasts is through voice-to-voice conversation. So can you discuss a little bit about how we are discovering podcasts? Do you have any thoughts around the different tools with YouTube, or some of the challenges that we need to think about as we try to address the discoverability problem in podcasting?
I think the number one way that people find podcasts is through social media these days, but also through word of mouth. People telling other people, "Oh, I heard this great podcast; it's well worth a listen." And again, quite a lot of this comes back to niche, comes back to who your audience is. If you're doing a podcast about, I don't know, competitive swimming, for example, then it's really easy to find the communities that exist around competitive swimming. It's really easy to understand how you might focus on that particular niche. There are conferences, there are events, obviously. There are things that you can do to reach those types of people. So it doesn't all have to happen online. It can happen in real life as well. And one of the big secrets of helping you promote a podcast is obviously to call your podcast a sensible name. Don't try and be clever with your puns or anything else, because people are typically searching for things that they are interested in. Don't call it some clever swimming pun if you're doing a competitive swimming show. Focus on calling it the competitive swimming show, because that's what people are going to be searching for. I learned that from Max Cutler, that used to run Parcast, now runs Pave Studios. And I mean, he had a show about serial killers, Dan, and it was called Serial Killers. I mean, you couldn't ask for anything better. So
Right.
things like that are super useful. There are technical ways that you can help as well. There's there's this thing which you'll see in some podcast apps, which allow you as a creator to recommend other shows that your audience might like, and similarly other shows to recommend shows that they think their audience will like as well. That's always worthwhile having a look at and working out, are there shows that are like yours but aren't competitors? Is it worth guesting on each other's show? Is it worth promoting each other's show from your own podcast, and so on and so forth? Are the things that you can be doing there. And the QR code, the humble QR code, is a really useful thing. Obviously, A, get a website for your podcast. That's really important. But then B, get a nice QR code that's built to push people towards that website. That is then a great thing to hand out on your business card, to hand out on places that you might be going, so that you've got a really easy and quick way to help people find your podcast and start listening to it.
I'm surprised sometimes by the number of people who don't have websites, or who do have websites for their podcast, or at least where their podcast lives, and they make it really hard to find. And even just putting Apple and Spotify and other links in the footer alongside the Facebook and X and Instagram or whatever else makes a lot of sense to make it much more discoverable. Because if you're sending people off to go to these other social media platforms, why not send people off to also be able to listen to your brand voice and content you've curated for that audience that you're trying to get to your website? Anyway, so in this industry, we know that there needs to be money. Otherwise, this industry is not really going to take off. So some of the ways that people have sort of approached this over the years is through advertising. So can you share a little bit about how advertising has changed and how advertisers' approach to podcasting has changed? And maybe we can also touch on some of the other ways that people are monetizing their content.
Yeah, and you'll know more than I do in terms of the tight regulation that also happens in terms of health advertising and those sorts of things. The beauty about the way that advertising works now in the podcast world is that advertising can be geo-targeted. If you're not allowed to advertise a certain thing in a certain country, then you don't have to. Or if you only want to advertise within a certain country or a certain state, then you can do that too. So that's certainly super helpful in terms of the way that advertising works. Lots of different ways to buy your way into podcasts. One of the ways that works particularly well, and you have to tread a little bit carefully because of the FTC guidelines, but one of the ways that works particularly well is host-read podcasts rather than just a radio spot. Radio spots are fine, and they do a good job on a podcast. But actually having the host, having someone who you trust, telling you about a product, telling you about a service, is a very good way of using the benefit of podcast and the intimacy of podcasts. Now, you have to be careful that host isn't saying that they've tried something when they haven't, of course, and there's all of those things that you should just be aware of. But certainly, host-read advertising is a really powerful tool, and I'm always surprised at how many advertisers just think, oh, well, we'll just put our radio spot into a podcast and we'll just focus on that. Actually, getting to know the podcast hosts, getting to know the people who people are tuning into is a much more useful way of thinking about how podcasting works. Certainly the basics in terms of that, but lots of different ways, of course, of getting brands out and helping people find brands and services that you want them to.
A lot of people in the audience will be aware of the volume of data that healthcare has around CPT codes and ICD-10 or ICD-11 codes, and being able to track prescriptions and the care that's being provided, using that for targeted display advertising in an anonymized and HIPAA compliant way. But I don't think people really fully appreciate the capability of being then able to add an audio component on top of that can, as you say, geo-target. So if there are particular areas where clinical trials are having a difficult time recruiting participants in their clinical trial, well, those might be the areas where also there's difficulty in access to care. So making people aware of those clinical trials as an opportunity to receive care is a really important thing. And it also helps advance research and bring new things to market. So there's lots of capabilities here that's part of the reason that I want to help to bring the podcast industry into healthcare and healthcare into podcasting, is to be able to look at these sorts of technical aspects and see how we can really create these omni-channel campaigns that can serve audiences better, whether they're professionals or the general public, and really try to advance this. So every week you do that weekly show on Fridays. I think you actually missed 1 week just recently. You replayed a previous episode. Is that right? You've got quite a track record of producing that each Friday, right?
Yes, and it wasn't a rerun. It was a whole new piece of content. But normally we don't go and interview somebody for 45 minutes. But Sam and I were both out, weirdly, for just 1 week. But no, we've produced. It's a weekly show, and it looks back at the week's podcasting news. There's normally interviews in there as well. It's normally around about 90 minutes. Sam wants to make it longer. I always want to make it shorter. But I'm the editor in the end of the day, so I have the power. And it's a great show to put together. Sam is very good at getting guests onto the show as well. And it's nice to be able to go back at the end of a week and be able to put some of the news that we hear and some of the news that we react to. You'll know, of course, how quick the whole news cycle is now. It's nice to be able to have a look back over a week and be able to contextualize some of the changes that have actually taken place in the industry. So, so I enjoy doing it. It's a fun thing to do.
So I listen to this weekly, and all 90 minutes, I listen to the very, very end until you read through the sets and the booths and everything. So yes. Really appreciate the content that you're creating there. It is a pretty big time commitment. I can appreciate that my engineering background and healthcare interests, I want to make sure I'm aware of everything that's happening in the podcast industry so I can bring it into the healthcare environment. So if you don't necessarily want to engage in the content, follow some of the information we have in the community, because we're going to be posting information that we learn from Sam and James in that environment and try to distill that down into ways that you can consume it, but also do encourage. What's that?
And you can always, of course, just get the newsletter instead. It's deliberately built to be a fast read, normally only a couple of minutes read. So that's certainly a good way of doing it too, Dan. Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly encourage people to subscribe to your newsletter, the daily newsletter, and tune into the daily podcast that you do, because the podcast is only like 5 minutes on a daily basis, 3 to 5 minutes. I think you just go through the newsletter. So if you don't want to necessarily read that on your inbox, you can just get all the same information, and it's distilled very quickly. James is a former BBC radio guy, so he knows how to get this information across really clearly for the listeners. Is there anything you would say specifically to us working in healthcare? Anything that you think, based on your understanding, you are a person with health? I don't know how much you've had to interface with the healthcare system, but with your experience in podcasting, this seems like this is an area that's sort of late to come in, which is typical for healthcare. Any opportunities or things that you would advise us to think about as we work to add value here?
I think probably one of the things that I would say is make sure that the content that you put out there is searchable. Make sure that you keep the back catalog, if you like, as timeless as possible. Because I bet that there are a bunch of podcasts that people might want to go back through the back catalog and learn a little bit more about certain things, whether it's certain treatments or certain ailments they may have or whatever it is. And so actually making sure that you're intentional in making sure that your content isn't obviously out of date, I think would make a bunch of sense. So, we talk a lot about evergreen content, and I think that that's certainly something just to bear in mind there.
James, where can people find you and connect with you? You've got your own personal website. Where do you spend time on your social medias?
I've left X behind for reasons, but I'm now on Mastodon. You can find me there. Just search for my name, and I'm sure that you'll find me there. But I enjoy spending time on there. I'm on LinkedIn because I kind of have to be, but I kind of wish I wasn't. So Mastodon is usually the one that I spend time on. But obviously, podnews.net is the main thing. And if you're interested in the whole world of podcasting, you'll find not just the news on that site, but you will also find jobs and events and those sorts of things. And look up your own podcast in there. If you're already if you're already producing a podcast for yourself, look up your own podcast in there, because you will find things that our automated checkers will point out and go, are you aware that you didn't have a trailer? Or are you aware that you aren't in the iHeart app, or whatever it happens to be? So that might be a useful thing in there as well.
It's a great website. You've got articles in there in terms of the tech stack you use, the various products, the history of podcasting, and people are interested in understanding how this has evolved, because some people think it's a new thing. Some people think it's been around for years and that it's going to reach a peak and sort of fade off. We haven't seen that happen with YouTube. That's continued to grow over the same trajectory of podcasts in the 20-year history or so of podcasts and YouTube. That's continued to grow. And I believe we're going to continue to see that here in the podcast world. James, thank you for everything that you do. I appreciate you coming on and being a guest here at Health Podcast Summit and sharing your knowledge. I appreciate everything you're working to do through Pod News, and I'm proud to have Health Podcast Network be a supporter of what you're doing there. I want to encourage other people to subscribe, listen, and support the work that you're doing. So, James, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your support, and thank you for your time.